Okay, so today this is Mr. L and his boring political science notes, lecture notes, but we got to get through them so we can use our class time for something else. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Constitution of the United States and give you some background information about the Constitution and its structure and some of the events that led up to its formation. Try not to go on too long, but it is what it is, so we got to get through it. So first off, some familiar words for you. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, to ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Almost every school child in America at one time or another has been exposed to these famous words from the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Even today, I cannot say these words out loud without hearing the Schoolhouse Rock song in the back of my head. The document itself is remarkable. The U.S. Constitution, compared with others in the 50 states in the world, is relatively short, though. Because amending it is so difficult, it also has relatively few amendments. The Constitution has relatively remained largely intact over the past 200 years. To a great extent, this is because the principles set forth in the Constitution are sufficient that they can be adapted to meet the needs of a changing society. Now, how and why the U.S. Constitution was created is a story that's been told and retold over and over again, and I'm sure you've heard it plenty of times. It's worth repeating because knowing the historical and political context in which this government's machinery was formed is essential to understanding American government and politics today. The Constitution did not result just from creative thinking or from some smart guys. Many of its provisions were grounded in the political philosophy of the time. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 brought with them two important sets of influences: their political culture and their political experiences. In the years between the first settlements of the New World and the writing of the Constitution, Americans have developed a political philosophy about how people should be governed and had tried out several forms of government. These experiences gave the founders the tools with which they constructed the Constitution of the United States. Let's look at some background in the colonial period. In 1607, the English government and a group of farmers created a trade post known as Jamestown in what is now called Virginia. The Virginia Company of London was the first to establish the permanent English colony in the Americas. The King of England gave backers of the colony a charter granting them, quote, full power and authority to make laws for the good and welfare of the settlement, end quote. The colonists of Jamestown instituted a representative assembly, a legislature composed of individuals who represent the population, thus setting a precedent in government that was to be observed in later colonial adventures. Jamestown was not an immediate success, as you know. All of the 105 men who originally landed, 67 of them died within the first year, but 800 new arrivals in 1609 were added to their numbers. And by the spring of the next year, frontier hazards had cut their numbers down to 60. Of the 6,000 people who left England for Virginia between 1607 and 1623, 4,800 of them perished. And often this time is referred to as the starving time in Virginia. Climatological researchers suggest that this starving time may have been brought about by a severe drought in the Jamestown area, which lasted from 1607 to 1612. Now, the first New England colony was established in 1620, a group made up mostly of rich Puritan separatists who wished to break with the Church of England came over on the ship Mayflower to the New World, landing at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, before going ashore, the adult males, women weren't considered to have any political status, drew up the Mayflower Compact, which was signed by 41 of the 44 men of where the ship, on November 21st, 1620. The reason for the compact was fairly obvious. The group was outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company of London, and its charter was in the settlement of Virginia, not Massachusetts. So the separatist leaders feared that some of the Mayflower passengers might conclude that they were no longer under any obligations of civil obedience. Therefore, some form of public authority was imperative. As William Bradford, one of the separatist leaders, recalled in his accounts, there were, quote, discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers among them had let fall from them in the ship, that when they came ashore they would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them, end quote. The compact was not the Constitution. It was a political statement in which the signers agreed to create and submit to the authority of a government pending the receipt of a royal charter. The Mayflower Compact's historical and political significance is twofold, though. It depended on the consent of affected individuals, and it served as a prototype for similar compacts in American history. According to Samuel Eliot Morison, the compact proved the determination of the English immigrants to live under the rule of law, based on his work called The Consent of the People. Another outpost in New England was set up by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Then followed Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and others. By 1732, the last of the 13 colonies, Georgia, was established. During the colonial period, Americans developed the concepts of limited government, which followed from the establishment of the first colonies under Crown charters. Theoretically, London governed the colonies, but in practice, owing partly to the colonies' distance from London, the colonies exercised a large measure of self-government. The colonists were able to make their own laws, as in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. The Massachusetts Body of Liberty in 1641 supported the protection of individual rights and was made a part of colonial law. In 1682, the Pennsylvania Framework of Government was passed, along with the Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges in 1701, which foreshadowed our own modern Constitution and Bill of Rights. All of this legislation enabled the colonists to acquire crucial political experience. After independence was declared in 1776, the states will quickly set up their own new state constitutions based upon what they learn in these documents. Now, the conflict between Great Britain and the American colonies, which ultimately leads to the Revolutionary War, began in the 1760s, when the British government decided to raise revenues by imposing taxes on the American colonies. Policy advisors to Great Britain's young King George III, who ascended the throne in 1760, decided that it was only logical to require the American colonists to help pay the cost of Great Britain defending them during the French and Indian War from 1756 to 1763. The colonists, who had grown accustomed to a large degree of self-government and independence from the British Crown, viewed the matter very differently. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act. Many colonists were unwilling to pay the tax imposed by the acts. Further regulatory legislation was certainly to come. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, providing for internal taxation. For as the colonists, they looked at this as taxation without representation, and so they gathered at the Stamp Act Congress, assembled in 1765. The colonists boycotted the purchase of English commodities in return. The success of the boycott generated a feeling of unity within the colonies. The British, however, continued to try to raise revenue in the colonies. When Parliament passed duties on glass, lead, paint, and other items in 1767, the colonists again boycotted British goods. The colonists' fury over taxation climaxed in the Boston Tea Party. Colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians and threw close to 350 chests of British tea into the Boston Harbor as a gesture of a tax protest. But who is the owner of the tea, I ask you? The king. And an attack on the king's property is an attack on the king himself. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, in 1774, which closed the Boston Harbor and placed the government of Massachusetts under direct British control. The colonists were outraged, and they responded. New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island proposed the convening of a colonial Congress. The Massachusetts House of Representatives requested that all colonies hold conventions to select delegates to be sent to Philadelphia for such a Congress. The First Continental Congress was held at Carpenter's Hall on September 5th, 1774 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was a gathering of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. Delegates from Georgia did not attend until 1775. Damn you, Georgia. At that meeting, there was little talk of independence, though. The Congress passed a resolution requesting that the colony send a petition to King George III expressing their grievances. Resolutions were also passed requiring that the colonies raise their own troops and boycott British trade. The British government condemned the Congress's actions, treating them as open acts of rebellion. The delegates of the First Continental Congress declared that in every county and city, a committee was to be formed whose mission was to spy on the conduct of friends and neighbors and to report to the press any violators of the trade ban. The formation of these committees of correspondence wasn't active cooperation among the colonies, which represented a stepped up amount of cooperation with the creation of a national government. By the time the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775, fighting had already broken out between the British and the colonists. One of the main actions of the Second Congress was to establish an army. It did this by declaring the militia that had gathered around Boston to be an army and naming George Washington as commander-in-chief. Congress, though, still attempted to reach a peaceful settlement with the British Parliament. One declaration of the Congress stated explicitly that, quote, "We have not raised armies that would have ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain and establishing independent states," end quote. But by the beginning of 1776, military encounters had become increasingly frequent. Public debate was acrimonious. Then, Thomas Paine's Common Sense appeared in Philadelphia bookstores. The pamphlet was a colonial bestseller. To do as well today, a book would have to sell between 9 million and 11 million copies in its first year of publication. Many agree that Paine did make common sense when he argued that, quote, "A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness, instability, unpredictability of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool and deliberate manner while we have it in our power than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. Thomas Paine, Common Sense. Paine further argued that, quote, nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence, end quote. Now, students of Paine's pamphlet point out that his arguments were not new. They were common in the tavern debates throughout the land. Rather, it was the near poetry of his words, which were at the same time as plain as the alphabet, that struck his readers. George Washington would later call Thomas Paine his greatest weapon of the Revolutionary War. On April 6, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted for free trade at all American ports with all countries except Great Britain. This act can be interpreted as an implicit declaration of independence. The next month, the Congress suggested that each of the colonies establish state governments unconnected to the state of Great Britain. Finally, in July, the Continental Congress declared their independence from Great Britain. On July 2nd, the Resolution of Independence was adopted by the Second Continental Congress. Quote, resolved that these united colonies are, and of rights, ought to be free and independent states. They are absolved from allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. End quote. Already by June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson was writing drafts of the Declaration of Independence in the second floor parlor of a bricklayer's house in the city of Philadelphia. On adoption of the Resolution of Independence, Jefferson argued that a declaration clearly putting forth the causes that compelled the colonies to separate from Great Britain was absolutely necessary. The Second Congress assigned the task to him. Jefferson's version of the Declaration was amended several times to gain universal, unanimous acceptance. For example, his condemnation of the slave trade was eliminated to satisfy the states of Georgia and North Carolina. The bulk of it was passed intact on July 4th, 1776. On July 19th, the modified draft became, quote, the unanimous declaration of these 13 United States of America. And on August 2nd, it was signed by the members of the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence has become one of the world's most famous and significant documents. The words opening the second paragraph of the Declaration are known most widely. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government. The assumption that people have natural rights or unalienable rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was a revolutionary concept at that time. Its use by Jefferson reveals the influence of the English philosopher John Locke, whose writings were familiar to educated American colonists, including Jefferson. In his work, Two Treatises on Government, published in 1690, Locke argued that all people possess certain natural rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and property, which Jefferson was most likely referring to when he said the pursuit of happiness, and that the primary purpose of government was to protect these rights. Furthermore, government was established by the people through a social contract, an agreement among the people to form a government and abide by its rules. As I talked about earlier, such contracts were compacts, and they weren't new to Americans. The Mayflower Compact was the first of these documents that established governments governing rules based upon the idea of the consent of the governed. Inciting the pursuit of happiness, though, instead of property as our rights, Jefferson clearly meant to go beyond Locke's thinking. After settling on these basic principles of government, the Declaration of Independence goes on to justify the colonists' revolt against Great Britain. Much of the remainder of the document is a list of what he, or King George III, has done to deprive the colonists of their rights. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the tasks of death, desolation, and tyranny scarcely heard of by a civilized leader. Ooh. The concepts of universal truths, natural rights, and government being established by a social contract expressed in the Declaration of Independence were to have a lasting impact on American life. The Declaration set forth ideals that have since become a fundamental part of our national identity. The Declaration of Independence also became a model for use by other nations around the world. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and eventually the Bill of Rights made the United States an exceptional country from its beginning. Now, a question that we must ask is, did we lose that status in recent years? One that deserves our thought. Certainly most Americans are familiar with the words of the Declaration of Independence, yet as Harvard historian David Armitage noted in his study of the Declaration in the international context, few Americans have pondered this obvious question: what does these assertions in the Declaration have to do with independence itself? Clearly, independence could have been achieved without these words. Even as late as 1857, Abraham Lincoln admitted, quote, "The assertion that all men are created equal was of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain, and it was placed in the Declaration not for that, but for our future use," end quote. Lincoln would claim to use the Declaration as a reasoning and a background for his Emancipation Proclamation. Essentially, the immediate significance of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was that it established the legitimacy of the new nation in the eyes of foreign governments, as well in the eyes of the colonists themselves. What the new nation needed most were supplies for its armies and a commitment for foreign military aid. Unless it appeared to the world as a political entity, separate and independent from Great Britain, no foreign government would enter into any agreement with its leaders. Once that Declaration had fulfilled its purpose of legitimizing the American Revolution, the document was all but forgotten for many years. The lasting significance of the Declaration as a founding document setting forth American ideals came much later. According to scholar Pauline Maier, the Declaration did not become enshrined as what she calls, quote, American scripture, end quote, until the late 1800s. Although the colonists had formally declared independence from Great Britain, the fight to gain actual independence continues for 5 more years, until General Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown in 1781. And in 1783, after Great Britain formally recognizes the independent status of the United States in the Treaty of Paris, Washington will then finally disband the army, but not till then. During these years of military struggles, the states will face additional challenges of creating systems of self-government for an independent United States. Some colonists had demanded that independence be preceded by the formation of a strong central government. But others, who called themselves Republicans at the time, were against a strong central government. They opposed monarchy, they opposed executive authority, and virtually any form of restraint on the power of local groups. From 1776 to 1780, all of these states will adopt written constitutions. 11 of these constitutions were completely new. Only 2 of them, those of Connecticut and Rhode Island, were old royal charters with only minor modifications. Republican sentiment led to the increased power for state legislatures, and that's not a surprise to us. In Georgia and Pennsylvania, unicameral and one-body legislatures were unchecked by executive or judicial authority. Basically, Republicans attempted to maintain the politics of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. In almost all the states, the legislature was the predominant body of government. Now, the fear of a powerful central government led to the passage of the Articles of Confederation, which created a weak central government. The term confederation is important to us. It means a voluntary association of independent states in which the member states agree to only a limited restraint on their freedom of action. In other words, the states themselves are not giving up their sovereignty. As a result, confederations seldom have an effective executive authority. In June of 1776, the Second Continental Congress began the process of drafting what would become the Articles of Confederation. The final form of the Articles was achieved by November 15, 1777, a little bit more than a year later. But it's not till March 1st of 1781 that the last state, Maryland, agrees to ratify these Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Well before the final battle for ratification of the Articles, many of them have to be implemented, though. The Continental Congress and the 13 states are conducting American military, economic, and political affairs, and they're really not equipped to do that during a period of war. Under the Articles, the 13 original colonies, now let's call them states, that were established on March 1st, 1781, we're going to call this the new government of the states, the Congress of the Confederation. Now, this Congress wasn't a unicameral assembly, or was a unicameral assembly of so-called ambassadors from each state. But each state only had one vote. So you have a one state, one vote principle. Each year, the Congress would choose one of its members as its president. And we would call that person the presiding officer. But the Articles themselves did not provide for a president of the United States. So there was no real executive. The Articles were authorized in Article 10 to appoint an executive committee of the states to execute in the recess of Congress such of the powers of Congress as the United States in Congress assembled by the consent of 9 of 13 states shall from time to time think expedient to vest with them. Good luck thinking what that means. The Congress was also allowed to appoint other committees and civil officers necessary for the managing of the general affairs of the United States. In addition, Congress could regulate foreign affairs and manage weights and measures. But it did lack an independent source of revenue, and that's its biggest problem. It could not tax. And it did lack a necessary executive machinery to force decisions throughout the national territory as a whole. Now, Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation guaranteed that each state would retain its sovereignty. Now, the new government did have some accomplishments during its 8 years of existence, so it's not valid to say that it was a complete and utter failure. Certain states' claims to Western lands were settled under the Articles of Confederation. This is what held up the ratification of the Articles in the first place. Maryland objected to the claims of Carolinas, Connecticut, Georgia, Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia to all the Western lands, to lands west of their states. If you look at a map of that time, the western border is undefined. It was only after these states consented to give up their claims to that land to the national government as a whole that Maryland agreed to sign the Articles of Confederation. Another accomplishment under the Articles was the passage of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which established a basic pattern of government for new territories north of the Ohio River. So all in all, the Articles represent the first real pooling of resources among American states. So there are a couple of accomplishments, but in spite of these, the Articles of Confederation had a tremendous number of defects. Although Congress has the legal right to declare war and to conduct foreign policy, it didn't have any right to demand revenue from the states. So how do you pay for war? It can only ask for money. And additionally, the actions of the Congress require the consent of 9 states. So if you had enough of the smaller states banding together or enough of the larger states banding together, you could essentially tie up the Congress and keep it from doing anything. Any amendments to the Articles, as flawed as it was, required the unanimous consent of the Congress and confirmation by every single state legislature. And furthermore, the Articles had no national system of courts. There was no judiciary. Basically, the functioning of government under the Articles depended on the goodwill of the states. And Article 3 of the Articles themselves simply established a league of friendship among the states. And that's all that was intended for this new national government. Probably the most fundamental weakness of the Articles and the most basic cause of their eventual replacement by the Constitution was the lack of power to raise funds for the militia. The Articles contain no language giving Congress coercive powers to raise revenues or taxes to provide adequate support for military forces controlled by Congress. When states refused to send money to support this new government, not a single state met its financial requests that Congress made under it. Congress resorted to selling off Western lands to speculators or issuing bonds that sold for much less than their face value. So due to a lack of resources, the Continental Congress was even forced to disband the Army. And this is at a time where you've got serious threats that are facing this new nation from European powers. From the south, you have Spain and Florida, and you still have Great Britain out west and north of you, and France is still lurking around. So there are some real threats out there. Now, because of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, the central government could do little to maintain any peace or order in the new nation. The states bickered among themselves and increasingly taxed each other's goods. At times, they prevented trade altogether. A couple of states, Virginia being one of them, shut its borders down. At times, it prevented, or in 1784, the country faced a serious economic depression. Banks were calling in old loans, refusing to give new ones. There was no specie, and species gold or silver or precious metal. So they were using paper money. And we all know by printing paper money, and that's not backed up by serious financial credit, that it becomes inflationary. And that's what we started seeing here in this new nation. People who couldn't pay their loans, though, in this period were thrown into prison. So you have a large number of debtor prisons. By 1786 in Concord, Massachusetts, the scene of one of the very first battles of the Revolutionary War, there were 3 times as many people in prison for debt as there were for all other crimes combined. In Worcester County, Massachusetts, the ratio was even higher, 20-1. Most of the prisoners there, though, were small farmers who couldn't pay their debt because of the disorganized state of the economy. Even if they wanted to pay their debt, Massachusetts had a law saying that they had to pay their debts in gold or silver, of which no one had any. So, when you see economic crisis, that often leads to political crisis. So in August of 1786, mobs of musket-bearing farmers, led by former Revolutionary War Captain Daniel Shays, seized the county courthouse and disrupted the trial of debtors in Springfield, Massachusetts. Shays and his men then launched an attack on the federal arsenal at Springfield. But fortunately for us, they were repulsed and driven back. Shays' rebellion demonstrated that the central government could not protect the citizens from armed rebellion or provide adequately for the public welfare. The rebellion spurred the nation's political leaders to action. As John Jay writes to Thomas Jefferson in this period, quote, "Changes are necessary, but what they ought to be, what they will be, and how and when they are to be produced are arduous questions. I feel for the cause of liberty. If it should not take root in this soil, little pains will be taken to cultivate it in any other." That's John Jay writing to Thomas Jefferson, who at this point is over-representing this new United States in France as its ambassador. Now, the Virginia legislature is going to call for a meeting of all states to be held in Annapolis, Maryland on September 11th, 1786, presumably to discuss their commercial trade problems. But it's evident to those in attendance, including Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, that this national government has some serious weaknesses and that it has to be addressed if it's going to survive. Among the important problems that need to be solved were the relationship between the states and the central government, the powers of the national legislature, the need for executive leadership, and the establishment of policies for economic stability. The result of this meeting was a petition to the Continental Congress for a general convention to meet in Philadelphia of 1787 to, quote, "consider the exigencies of the Union," end quote. Congress approves this convention in February of 1787. But when those who favor a weak central government realize that the Philadelphia meeting would in fact take place, they endorse the convention, but with a caveat. They make sure that the convention would be summoned, quote, "for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation only." So, in a sense, you're telling these delegates that all they can do is fix the government that they have. They cannot make a new one. But those in favor of a strong national government are going to have a whole different idea for this process. Now, the designated date for the opening of the convention at Philadelphia, now known today as the Constitutional Convention, was May 14, 1787. Because few of the delegates had actually arrived in Philadelphia by that time, though, the convention was not formally opened in the East Room of the Pennsylvania State House until May 25th. 55 of the 74 delegates chosen for the convention actually attended the convention. Of those 55, only about 40 of them played an active role in the convention. We call these men framers. Right? The difference between a framer and a founding father is a framer actually helps in the writing of the Constitution. A founding father is just active in the development of the new nation. Therefore, Thomas Jefferson is a founding father, but he's not a framer because he's not in attendance at this Constitutional Convention. Get the difference? Okay. Rhode Island is the only state that refuses to send a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Who were these men? Who were these 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention? They certainly do not represent a cross-section of American society in the 1700s, that's for sure. Indeed, most of them are going to be upper middle class to upper class, considering the following facts. 33 of them are lawyers. 3 are doctors. Almost 50% of these individuals were college graduates. 7 were former chief executives or governors of their respective states. 6 were owners of very large plantations, and 8 were very important business persons. And they were also relatively young by today's standards. James Madison was 36. Alexander Hamilton, he was only 32. And Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey was only 26 years old. But of course, the venerable Benjamin Franklin was 81, and he had to be carried into the convention on a portable chair borne by 4 prisoners from a local jail. I always like to include that in my section here. I just think that's kind of cool. If you don't count Franklin, the average age of these framers of the Constitution was just over 42. Now, the conditions in which these delegates worked for the next 115 days were typically really not ideal, and they were made even worse by the necessity of having to work in complete and total secrecy. The framers of the Constitution believed that if public debate were to play into some of the particular positions, delegates would have a much more difficult time compromising in order to reach agreement. Consequently, the windows were usually shut in the east room of the State House. And with the air being very humid and hot by the noon of each day, the room in the State House in Pennsylvania became almost unbearable. When the windows were open, flies swarmed into the room. The delegates did, however, have a nearby tavern that they liked to retire to in the evening, called the Indian Queen. The Indian Queen became the informal headquarters of the delegates, and much of the real discussion about the Constitution actually takes part at the floor of the tavern of the Indian Queen. Now, we know much about the proceedings at the convention because James Madison kept a daily, detailed personal journal. He writes down everything that everybody says. A majority of the delegates were strong nationalists. They wanted a strong, centralized government with real power, unlike the central government under the Articles of Confederation, which had really no power whatsoever. Now, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, they preferred a limited national authority based upon the idea of separation of powers, but they were willing to accept any type of government as long as the delegates as a whole came to some sort of consensus. A few advocates of the strong centralized government were led by Governor Morris of Pennsylvania and John Rutledge of South Carolina. And these individuals really were the ones that distrusted the ability of the common people to engage in this idea of self-government. They were very distrustful of democracy. Among the nationalists, several went so far as to support the idea of a monarch. This group included Alexander Hamilton, who was chiefly responsible for the Annapolis Convention. In a very long speech on June 18th, he presented his views. Quote, "I have no scruple in declaring that the British government is the best in the world, and I doubt much whether anything short of it will do in America." End quote. Another important group of nationalists were of a more democratic stripe, led by James Madison of Virginia, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, another very important framer. These democratic nationalists wanted a central government founded on the idea of popular support. Still another faction consisted of nationalists who were less democratic in nature and who would support a centralized government only if it was founded on very narrowly defined Republican principles. This group made up of a relatively small number of delegates, including Virginian Edmund Randolph and George Mason, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, and Luther Martin and John Francis Mercer of Maryland. Many of the other delegates from Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, New Hampshire, and New Jersey were concerned really about only one thing, and that was claims to Western lands. As long as those lands became the common property of all the states collectively, these delegates were willing to support a centralized government. And finally, there was a group of delegates there who were totally against the national authority. 2 of the 3 delegates from New York will quit the convention when they see the nationalist direction of the convention itself. Now, the debates and the convention will start on the first day. James Madison had spent months reviewing European political theory. He really had done his homework. When his Virginia delegation arrived ahead of most of the others, they got to work right away. By the time George Washington opens the convention, Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia was prepared to present 15 resolutions. Now, in retrospect, this is a masterful stroke on the part of the Virginia delegation. It sets the agenda for the remainder of the convention. They've got their ducks in a row. Even though in principle the delegates had only been sent to Philadelphia for the sole purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation, they hadn't been sent to write a whole new constitution. One could make a very good argument that this is a second political revolution, while the first is a military revolution from Great Britain. This is the true revolution of the political revolution that sets the American engine of self-government, limited government, and economic freedom truly going in the direction that is going for the last 230 years. Randolph's 15 resolutions proposed an entirely new national government under a constitution. It was, however, a plan that favored large states, including Virginia. This is what it called for. It called for, first, a bicameral or two-chamber legislature, with the lower chamber chosen from the people, and the smaller upper chamber chosen from the lower chamber, their nominees selected by state legislatures. The number of representatives would be proportional to a state's population. Therefore, it would greatly favor the large states. And the legislature could void any state laws that it didn't agree with. It would create an unspecified national executive who would be elected by the legislature. And it would create a national judiciary, also appointed by the legislature. Now, it didn't take long for the small states to realize that life was going to be pretty bad for them under the Virginia Plan, which enabled Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia to really form a majority in this national legislature under this plan. The debate on the plan drags on for 4 or 5 weeks. It was time for these small states to come up with a plan of their own. So on June 15th, William Paterson of New Jersey offers an alternative plan. After all, argues Paterson, under the Articles of Confederation, all states had equality. Therefore, the convention had no power to change this arrangement. So therefore, he proposes the following. Number one, the fundamental principle of the Articles of Confederation, the one state, one vote principle would be retained. 2, Congress would be able to regulate trade and impose taxes. 3, all acts of Congress would be the supreme law of the land. 4, several people would be elected by Congress to form an executive office. And 5, the executive office would appoint a Supreme Court. Now, basically, the New Jersey Plan is simply an amendment of the Articles of Confederation. Its only real notable feature was its reference to the supremacy doctrine, which was later included in the Constitution, this idea that the Constitution will be the supreme law of the land. Now, these delegates now are at an impasse. What are they going to do? Most wanted the strong national government and were unwilling even to consider the New Jersey Plan. But when the Virginia Plan was brought up again, the small states threatened to leave the conference altogether. It's not until July 16 that a compromise is reached. Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposes the following. 1, a bicameral legislature in which the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, would be apportioned according to the number of free inhabitants in each state, plus 3/5 of all other persons. An upper chamber, 2, the Senate would have 2 members from each state elected by state legislatures. Now, this plan, known as the Great Compromise, and it's also known as the Connecticut Compromise because of the role of the Connecticut delegates in the proposal, broke the deadlock between small states and large states. It did exact a political price, though, because it permits each state to have equal representation in the upper house, the Senate. Having 2 senators represent each state, in effect, dilutes the voting power of citizens living in the more heavily populated states and gives the smaller states a disproportionate political power. But the Connecticut Compromise resolves this large state, small state controversy. In addition, the Senate acted as part of a check and balance system against the House, which many feared would be dominant by the masses in public opinion. The Great Compromise also settled another major issue. How are we going to deal with slaves in the representation question? Slavery is still legal in many northern states in this period, but it's really mainly concentrated in the South, and very quickly it's going to become illegal in the North. Many delegates were opposed to slavery and wanted it banned entirely in this convention. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina led the strong Southern opposition to a ban on slavery. Furthermore, the South wanted slaves to be counted along with free persons when determining representation in Congress. Delegates from northern states, of course, objected. Sherman's 3/5 proposal was a compromise between northerners who did not want slaves counted at all and southerners who wanted them counted in the same way as free whites. Actually, Sherman's Connecticut plan spoke of 3/5 of all other persons. And that's the language of the Constitution itself. The word slave doesn't appear in the document. But it's not hard to figure out who those other persons were. The 3/5 compromise illustrates the power of the southern states at the convention. The 3/5 rule meant that the House of Representatives and the Electoral College would be apportioned in part on the basis of property, specifically property in slaves. Now, modern commentators have referred to the 3/5 rule as, in a sense, that African Americans were only valued as 3/5 as much as whites. Actually, the additional Southern representatives that were elected because of the 3/5 rule didn't represent the slaves at all. Rather, these representatives were a gift to slave owners. The additional representatives enhanced the political power of slave owners in Congress and voted exactly opposite of what was in the best interest of slaves. Now, this 3/5 compromise doesn't completely settle the slavery issue. There's also the question of the slave trade itself. Eventually, the delegates will agree that Congress cannot ban the importation of slaves until after the year 1808. The compromise meant that the matter of slavery itself was never addressed directly. The South wins 20 years of unrestricted slave trade and a requirement that escaped slaves in free states be returned to their owners in the slave states. Now, clearly, many delegates, including George Washington and James Madison, had serious doubts about slavery. Why then did they allow slavery to continue? Historians have long maintained that the framers had no choice, that without a slavery compromise, the delegates of the South would have abandoned the convention. Indeed, this was the fear that a number of the anti-slavery delegates had at the convention. Madison, for example, said, quote, "Great as the evil is, a dismemberment of the Union would be even worse," end quote. But other scholars, however, contend that it would not only have been possible for the framers to ban slavery, but by doing so they would have achieved greater unity for the new nation as a whole. You'll have to decide that for yourself. The South also worried that the Northern majority in Congress would pass legislation unfavorable to its economic interests. Because the South depended on agricultural exports, it feared the imposition of export taxes. In return for acceding to the Northern demand that Congress be able to regulate commerce among the states and with other nations, the South obtained a promise that export taxes would never be imposed. So as a result, today, the United States is one of the few countries that does not tax its exports as they leave. There were some other disagreements as well. The delegates could not decide whether to establish only a Supreme Court or create lower courts as well. They deferred by mandating a Supreme Court and then allowing Congress to establish the lower courts. They also disagreed over whether the President or the Senate would choose the Supreme Court justices, so therefore a compromise was reached that allowed the president to nominate the justices, and then the Senate would confirm those nominations. They would give advice and consent. These compromises, as well as many others, resulted from the recognition that if one group of states refused to ratify the Constitution, then the entire Constitution itself was most likely doomed. Now, the Connecticut Compromise was reached by mid-July. The makeup of the executive branch and judiciary, however, was left pretty well unsettled. The remaining work of the convention was turned over to a 5-man committee of detail, which presented a rough draft of the Constitution on August 6th. It made executive and judicial branches subordinate to the legislative branch. That's not a not a coincidence. They believed that the legislative branch was the primary branch of government. This major issue of separation of powers, though, had not yet been resolved. The delegates were concerned with structuring the government to prevent the imposition of tyranny, either by a majority or by a minority. It was Madison who proposed this governmental scheme, sometimes called the Madisonian model, in order to achieve this. The executive, legislative, and judicial powers of government were to be separated, and so that no one branch had enough power to dominate the others. This separation of powers was by function, as well as by personnel, with Congress passing laws, the President enforcing and administering laws, and courts interpreting laws in individual circumstances. Each of the 3 branches of government would be independent of the others, but they would have to cooperate in order to govern. According to Madison, in Federalist Paper number 51, quote, "The greatest security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others," end quote. The constitutional means Madison is referring to is a system of checks and balances through which each branch of government can check the actions of the others. For example, Congress can enact laws, but the President has veto powers over congressional acts. The Supreme Court has the power to declare acts of Congress and of the executive unconstitutional, but the President appoints the justices on the Supreme Court with the advice and consent of the Senate. The Supreme Court's power to declare acts unconstitutional is not in the Constitution, although arguably the framers assumed that the court would have this power. I'll talk about judicial review a little bit later in this lecture. Now, Madison's ideas for separation of powers and checks and balances aren't new at all. Indeed, the influential French political thinker Baron de Montesquieu, in his book Spirit of the Law, explores these concepts in great detail in 1748. Montesquieu not only discusses the 3 sorts of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, that are exercised by any government, but he also gave many examples how in some nations certain checks on these powers had risen and some had been very effective in preventing tyranny. So the framers had learned from this. In the years since the Constitution was ratified, checks and balances built into the Constitution have evolved into a give and take among these different branches of government. Generally, for years, nearly every check that one branch has over another, that branch has found a way of getting around that check. For example, suppose that the President checks Congress by vetoing a bill. Congress can then override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote of its own. Additionally, Congress holds what we call the power of the purse. If it disagrees with a program endorsed by the President, it can simply refuse to appropriate funds necessary to operate that program. Similarly, the President can impose a counter check on Congress in the Senate by if the Senate refuses to confirm one of his presidential appointments, he can just wait until Congress takes a recess and make what's called a recess appointment, which doesn't require the Senate's approval at all. Now, some delegates favored a plural executive made up of representatives from the various regions. Now, this was abandoned in favor of a single chief executive. And some argued that Congress should choose that person. But to make the president completely independent of the proposed Congress, the delegates invented this idea of an electoral college. Now, to be sure, the Electoral College created a cumbersome presidential election process. The process even makes it possible for a candidate who comes in second in the popular vote to become president by being the top vote getter in the Electoral College, which happened most recently in the year 2000. But the Electoral College insulates the president from direct popular control. The 7-year single term that some of the delegates had proposed was replaced by a 4-year term with the possibility of re-election. On September 17, 1787, the Constitution was approved by 39 delegates. All the 55 who had originally attended, or of those 55, only 42 remained at the end of the convention. 3 delegates refused to sign the Constitution. All others approved at least of part of the Constitution, or disapproved of part of it, but signed it anyway so they could begin the ratification debate. The Constitution that was to be ratified established the following fundamental principles: popular sovereignty, or control by the people; a republican government in which people choose representatives to make decisions for them; limited government with written laws in contrast to the powerful British government against which colonists had rebelled; separation of powers with checks and balances among branches to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power; and a federal system that allowed for states' rights because the states feared too much of a centralized control. Now, we're going to learn much more about this idea of federalism in a later unit. Let's suffice it to say here, though, that a federal system, as was established by the framers, gave sovereign powers, or ruling powers, divided those between states and the national government. The Constitution expressly granted these powers, granted some powers to the national government. For example, the national government is given the power to regulate commerce among the states. The Constitution also declares that the president is the nation's chief executive and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Additionally, the Constitution makes it clear that laws made by the national government take priority over conflicting state laws. At the same time, the Constitution provides for extensive states' rights, including the right to control commerce within their own state borders, and to exercise those governing powers that were not delegated to the national government. The federal system created by the framers was a very novel form of government. At that time, no other country in the world had such a system. It's the oldest federal system in the world. It was invented by the framers as a compromise over whether states or the central government should have ultimate sovereignty over the people. As we're going to see later, though, the debate over where the line should be drawn between states' rights and the national government has been an ongoing debate in American politics ever since. The framers did not go into detail about where that line should be drawn, though, so therefore it leaves it up to us, students, scholars, judges, to try to define the framers' intentions and to shape our society forthwith. Now, the framers knew that ratification of the Constitution was far from certain. Indeed, because it was almost guaranteed that many state legislatures would not ratify it, the delegates agreed that every state should hold a special convention strictly for the purpose of ratifying the Constitution. Elected delegates to these conventions would then discuss it and vote on the Constitution itself. Further departing from the Articles of Confederation, the delegates agreed that as soon as 9 states, rather than all 13, approved the Constitution, it would then take effect and Congress could begin to organize the new government. Now, 2 opposing forces in this battle of ratification were Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, those in favor of a strong centralized government and the new Constitution, had a great advantage over their opponents, who we're going to call the Anti-Federalists, who wanted to prevent the Constitution as it was drafted from being ratified. In the first place, the Federalists had assumed a positive name. They're Federalists, and they're leaving their opposition the negative label of being Anti-Federalist. Who wants to be anti-anything? More importantly, though, the Federalists had attended the Constitutional Convention, and they knew all the arguments and all the deliberations that had taken place. Their opponents didn't have any of that knowledge, because those deliberations hadn't been open to the public. Remember, they were secret. Thus, the Anti-Federalists were at a disadvantage in terms of information about the document. The Federalists also had time, power, and money on their side. Communications in this period were slow. Those who had access to the best communications were Federalists themselves, mostly wealthy bankers, lawyers, plantation owners, merchants living in urban areas where the communications were better. The Federalist campaign was organized relatively quickly and effectively to elect Federalists as delegates to state ratifying conventions, not Anti-Federalists. But the Anti-Federalists had at least one strong point in their favor. They stood for the status quo. And in general, the greater burden is usually placed on those who are advocating change and not on staying the same. In the state of New York, opponents of the Constitution were quick to attack it. Alexander Hamilton answered their attacks in newspaper columns with the signature Caesar. When the Caesar letters had little effect, Hamilton switched to the pseudonym Publius and secured two collaborators to help him, John Jay and James Madison. In a very short time, those three political figures wrote a series of 85 essays in defense of the Constitution and in defense of Republican forms of government. These widely read essays, called the Federalist Papers, appeared in New York newspapers from October of 1787 to October of 1788, and were reprinted in the newspapers of all the other states. Although we don't know for certain who wrote every single one, we're pretty sure, but we can't say 100%. It's pretty apparent that Alexander Hamilton was responsible for about 2/3 of these essays. These included very important ones about interpreting the Constitution, explaining the various powers of the three branches, and presenting the idea of judicial review. But Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, however, is considered a real classic in political theory. It deals with the nature of groups, or factions, as he calls them. In spite of the rapidity which the Federalist Papers were written, they are considered to be probably the best examples of political theorizing ever produced in the United States. They're difficult reads. You're going to have to read some of them, but they are the best examples of what was in the minds of the framers at the time of ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists used pseudonyms such as Montezuma and Philadelphus in their replies. Many of their attacks on the Constitution were also brilliant. The Anti-Federalists claimed that the Constitution was written by aristocrats and would lead to tyranny. More importantly, the Anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution would create an overburdening central government hostile to personal liberty. The Constitution said nothing about freedom of the press, freedom of religion, or any other individual liberty. It's not a document about rights, it's a document about protecting property. They wanted to include a list of guaranteed liberties or a Bill of Rights. Finally, the Anti-Federalists decried the weakened power of the states. They argued that it didn't mention God, and it took away from the states the power to print money. Now, the Anti-Federalists cannot be dismissed as unpatriotic extremists. They included such patriots as Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams. They were arguing for what had been the prevalent contemporary opinion of the time. This view was derived from the French political philosopher Montesquieu, who, as I mentioned earlier, was an influential political theorist of the time. Montesquieu believed that liberty was safe only in relatively small societies governed by direct democracy, or by a large legislature with very small districts. The Madisonian view, favoring a large republic, particularly expressed in Federalist Papers numbers 10 and 51, was actually the more unpopular view at the time. Madison was probably convincing because citizens were already persuaded that a strong national government was necessary to combat foreign enemies and to prevent domestic insurrections like Shays' Rebellion. Still, some researchers believe that it was mainly the bitter experiences with the Articles of Confederation, the poor economic experiences, rather than Madison's argument that persuades state conventions to ratify the Constitution. But the struggle for ratification will continue. Strong majorities are produced in Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut. After a bitter struggle in Massachusetts, that state ratifies the Constitution by a narrow margin on February 6, 1788. By the spring, Maryland and South Carolina have ratified by sizable majorities. Then on June 21st, New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. Now the Constitution can take effect. But it means little without Virginia and New York, the largest state, the wealthiest state. And New York is not even going to debate the Constitution for another month. In 1913, historian Charles Beard published an economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. This book launched a debate that has continued ever since. The debate over whether the Constitution was supported by a majority of Americans. Beard's central thesis was that the Constitution had been produced primarily by wealthy property owners whose desire to a stronger government had been to protect their property rights. Beard also claimed that the Constitution had been imposed by an undemocratic method to prevent democratic majorities from exercising real power. He pointed out, for example, there was no popular vote on whether to hold a constitutional convention in the first place. Furthermore, he said, even if such a vote had taken place, state laws generally restricted voting rights to property-owning white males, meaning that people in the country, males without property, women, Native American, and slaves, weren't eligible to vote. Finally, Beard pointed out that even the word democracy was distasteful to the framers, that the term was often used by conservatives to smear their opponents. I wonder if Mr. Beard had it right. We'll have to look at that when we look at that essay. As for the various state ratifying conventions, the delegates had been selected only by 150,000 of the approximate 4 million citizens. This doesn't seem very democratic by today's standards. Some historians have suggested that if a Gallup poll could have been taken at that time, the anti-Federalists probably would have outnumbered the Federalists. Certainly, some of the delegates to state ratifying conventions in areas were tired of the elite group of Federalists who ran the country, just as oppressive as the British had governed the colonies. That's what they were worried about. Amos Singletary, a delegate to the Massachusetts ratifying convention, contended that those who urged the adoption of the Constitution, quote, expect to get all the power and all the money into their own hands, and then they will swallow up some little folks just as the whales swallowed Jonah, end quote. Others who were similarly situated, though, felt differently. Jonathan Smith, who was also one delegate to the Massachusetts ratifying convention, regarded a strong national government as a, quote, cure for disorder, end quote. Of course, referring to the disorder caused by the rebellion of Daniel Shays and his followers. Much has been made of the various machinations used by Federalists to ensure the Constitution's ratifications. Federalists did resort to a variety of devious tactics, include purchasing at least one printing press to prevent the publication of anti-Federalist pamphlets. Yet the perception of strong centralized government was necessary to keep order and to protect the public welfare. appears to have been fairly persuasive among all the classes, rich and poor alike. Furthermore, although the need for strong government was a major argument in favor of adopting the Constitution, even the Federalists sought to craft a limited government. Compared with the constitutions adopted by other nations in later years, the U.S. Constitution, through its checks and balances, favors limited government over an energetic government to a marked degree. Now, the U.S. Constitution would not have been ratified in several important states, including here in Virginia, had Federalists not assured the states that amendments to the Constitution would be passed to protect individual liberties against incursions by the national government. Many of the recommendations of the state ratifying conventions included specific rights that were later considered by James Madison as he labored to draft what became called the Bill of Rights. Although called the Bill of Rights, essentially the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were a Bill of Rights, not a Bill of Rights, but a Bill of Limits, because the amendments limited the power of the national government over the rights and liberties of individuals. Ironically, a year earlier, Madison had told Thomas Jefferson, quote, "I had never thought the omission of a Bill of Rights a material defect of the Constitution," end quote. Madison was not the only framer who thought a Bill of Rights to be unnecessary. Many of them thought that state Bill of Rights were sufficient to protect individual liberty. Jefferson's enthusiasm for a Bill of Rights apparently influenced Madison, as did Madison's desire to gain popular support for his election to Congress. Madison promises in a campaign letter to voters that once elected, he would force Congress to, quote, "prepare and recommend to the states for ratification the most satisfactory provisions for all essential rights," end quote. Now, once there, Madison had to cull through more than 200 state recommendations. No small task, and in retrospect, he chose pretty darn well. One of the rights that he found appropriate for constitutional protection, but that later was left out, was the equal protection under the laws. But that was not commonly regarded as a basic right of the time. It's not until 1868 do the states ratify an amendment guaranteeing that no state shall deny equal protection to any person. Now, today, the Supreme Court applies this guarantee to certain actions of the federal government as well. The final number of amendments that Madison and his specifically appointed committee comes up with is 17. But Congress is going to tighten the language down on these, and they're going to eliminate 5 of them. And so they're going to be remaining with 12. 2 dealing with the apportionment of representatives and the compensation of members of Congress were not ratified immediately by states. Eventually, the Supreme Court decisions led to reform of the apportionment process, exactly what he was talking about in his amendment that wasn't later approved. And the amendment on the compensation of members of Congress ended up becoming ratified 203 years later in 1992. That's a really interesting story we'll talk about later. On December 15th, 1791, the National Bill of Rights was adopted when the state of Virginia agreed to ratify the 10 amendments. On ratification, the Bill of Rights became part of the U.S. Constitution. The basic structure of American government has already been established. Now the fundamental rights and liberties of individuals were also protected, at least in theory, at the national level. The proposed amendment that Madison characterized as, quote, "the most valuable amendment in the whole lot," end quote, which would have prohibited the states from infringing on the freedoms of conscience, press, and jury trial, had been eliminated by the Senate. Thus, the Bill of Rights as adopted did not limit state power, and individual citizens had to rely on the guarantees contained in a particular state constitution or state Bill of Rights. Actually, the country had to wait until the violence of the Civil War before significant limitations on state power in the form of the 14th Amendment became part of the national constitution. Now, of course, you can read through your Bill of Rights, and not that you can, you better, by going to the appendix in your book, and I'll try to post a virtual version on the class Facebook page. In addition to the rights and liberties specified in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, courts have also concluded that several of these amendments imply that our civil liberties also include a right to privacy. For many, the right to privacy, the right to be free from the government's prying eyes, is one of our most basic rights. Balancing this right against the government's need to protect society from criminal actions has become one of the most significant challenges of our time. So the Bill of Rights is not necessarily all of our written rights. There are many unwritten rights. Now, the Constitution itself consists of 7,000 words. It has 7 articles and 27 amendments. It is shorter than any state constitution except for the state of Vermont, which has 6,880 words. One of the reasons the federal Constitution is shorter than the framers had intended it is only because it's a framework for the new government. It's supposed to be interpreted by succeeding generations. One of the reasons that it's remained this way is that the formalist amending procedure does not allow for easy changes. Article 5 of the Constitution outlines the ways in which amendments can be made, proposed, and ratified. There are 2 formal methods for proposing an amendment to the Constitution. One method is a 2/3 vote in each chamber of Congress. A second method is a national convention that is called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of state legislatures. Now, this second method has never been used. We've gotten close a couple of times, but we've never called for this national convention. Ratification can occur by one of 2 methods. One, by a positive vote in 3/4 of legislatures of the various states, or 2, by special conventions called for in the states and a positive vote in 3/4 of them. Now, this second method has only been used once, to repeal prohibition. Prohibition was the ban on the production and sale of alcoholic beverages in the early 20th century. That situation was exceptional, though, because it involved an amendment, the 21st, which repealed a previous amendment, the 18th, which had created prohibition. State conventions were necessary for the repeal of the 18th Amendment because many state legislatures in the West, many conservative state legislatures, were pro-dry, and they would never have passed a repeal of prohibition. But the people wanted a repeal of prohibition. So note that Congress determines the method of ratification to be used by all states for each proposed constitutional amendment. Now, Congress has considered more than 12,000 amendments to the Constitution. Many proposed amendments have been advanced to address highly specific problems. An argument against such narrow amendments has been that amendments ought to embody broad principles in the way that the existing Constitution does. So for that reason, many people have opposed a narrow amendment, for example, as the one that protects the American flag from being burned in protest. Only 33 amendments have been submitted to the states after having been approved by the required 2/3 vote in each chamber of Congress, and only 27 have been fully ratified. Now, it should be clear that the amendment process is much more difficult than it seems. Because of the competing social and economic interests, the requirement to get 2/3 of both House and Senate has 290 House members and 67 senators, for those of you keeping score, is extremely difficult to achieve. 34 senators, representing only 17 sparsely populated states, can block any amendment to the Constitution. For example, the Republican-controlled House approved a balanced budget amendment within the first 100 days of the 104th Congress in 1995, but it was defeated in the Senate by not 3, not 2, but 1 vote. After an amendment has been approved by Congress, the process becomes even more arduous. 3/4 of state legislatures must then approve the amendment. only those amendments that have wide popular support across both political parties and in all regions of the country are likely to be approved. Why make this so hard? Well, one good reason is that the framers feared that a simple amendment process could lead to a tyranny of the majority, which a tyranny of the majority could pass amendments to oppress disfavored individuals and groups. The cumbersome amendment process also does not seem to stem the number of amendments that are proposed each year, especially in recent years. The trend recently is to propose more and more amendments. They just don't get past the proposal stage. A reading of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution reveals that the framers of the Constitution specified no time limit on the ratification process. The Supreme Court held that Congress can specify a time for ratification as long as the time limit is reasonable. Since 1919, most proposed amendments have had a requirement that ratification be within a 7-year process. This was the case with the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, which sought to guarantee equal rights for women. When 3/4 of states had not ratified in the allotted 7 years, however, Congress extended the limit by an additional 3 years and 3 months. That extension, though, expired on June 30th, 1982, and the amendments had still not been ratified. Another proposed amendment, which would have guaranteed congressional representation to the District of Columbia, fell far short of the 38 states' ratification vote that it needed up until August 22nd, 1985 deadline, and it died. On March 7th, 1992, Michigan became the 38th state to ratify the 27th Amendment, one of the 2 lost amendments of the 12 that James Madison originally sent to the states in 1789. Because most of the amendments proposed in recent years have been given a time limit of only 7 years, it was questionable whether the amendment would take effect even if the necessary number of states ratified it. Is 203 years too long a lapse of time between proposal and the final ratification? Well, apparently not, because the amendment was certified as legitimate by the constitutional archivist Don Wilson of the National Archives on May 18, 1992, and you have the 27th Amendment, which states that Congress may not give itself a pay raise or have a pay raise go into effect until after the next election period. The Constitution provides that a national convention requested by the legislatures of 2/3 of states can propose a constitutional amendment. Now, Congress has received approximately 400 convention applications since the Constitution was ratified. Every state has applied at least once. Fewer than 20 applications were submitted to the Constitution's in the Constitution's first 100 years, but more than 150 have been filed in the last 2 decades. No national convention has been held since 1787, though, and many national political and judicial leaders are very uneasy about the prospect of convening a body that could conceivably do exactly what the Constitutional Convention did, and that's create a new form of government and destroy the one we have. State legislative bodies that originate from national convention applications don't appear to be so uncomfortable with the idea, as more than 230 state constitutional conventions have been held in that same time period. What's the other way to change the Constitution? That's the formal way. That's the way we change the written words. How can we change the meaning without changing the words? Well, formal amendments are one way of changing the Constitution, and it is obvious from their small number. It doesn't happen very often. But if we discount the first 10 amendments, which were adopted soon after the ratification of the Constitution, there's really only been 17 formal changes in more than 200 years, and 2 of those changes canceled each other out. So if we look at the sparse number of formal constitutional amendments, this really gives us a very incomplete view of constitutional change. The brevity and ambiguity of the original document have permitted great alterations in the Constitution by way of varying interpretation. As the United States grows, both in population and in territory, new social and political realities both emerged in previous times and still emerge today. Congress, presidents, courts have found it necessary to interpret the Constitution's provisions in light of these new realities. The Constitution has proved to be a remarkably flexible document, adapting itself time and time again to the new realities of life. Constitution gives Congress, for example, the broad power to carry out its duties as the nation's legislative body. For example, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, although there is no clear definition of what foreign commerce or interstate commerce is. Congress has cited the Commerce Clause as the basis for passing thousands of laws that define the meaning of the Constitution. Similarly, Article 3, Section 1 states that the national judiciary shall consist of one Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as Congress shall make from time to time, ordain, and establish. Now, through a series of acts, Congress has used as a broad provision to establish the federal judiciary system of today. In addition, Congress has frequently delegated to federal agencies a legislative power to write regulations and acts. These regulations become law unless they're challenged in court. Nowhere does the Constitution give this sort of delegation of legislative authority. And even though the Constitution does not expressly authorize the President to propose bills or budgets to Congress, presidents since Woodrow Wilson have proposed hundreds of bills to Congress every year. Presidents rely on Article 2 authority as Commander-in-Chief. They send American troops all over the world into combat, although the Constitution provides that Congress is actually the one that has the power to declare war. Now, the President's power in wartime has waxed and waned throughout the course of American history. President George W. Bush significantly expanded the presidential power in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 2001. But until then, there had been a period of decline in the latitude that was given to presidents since the Vietnam War ended in 1975. We'll look at that dichotomy between the two when we get to the presidency. Presidents have also conducted foreign affairs by the use of executive agreements, which are legally binding documents made between presidents and a foreign head of state. The Constitution makes no mention of such documents. Another way of changing the Constitution or making it more flexible is through the process of power of judicial review. Judicial review refers to the power of U.S. courts to examine the constitutionality of actions undertaken by the legislative and executive branches of government. A state court, for example, may rule that a statute enacted by the state legislature is unconstitutional. And federal courts, and ultimately the United States Supreme Court, may rule unconstitutional not only acts of Congress and decisions of the national executive, but also state statutes, state executive actions, and even provisions of state constitutions. But yet, after all that, the Constitution doesn't even mention the power of judicial review. It's not even in the document. Those in attendance at the Constitutional Convention, though, probably expected that courts would have some authority to review the legality of acts by the executive and the legislative branches, because under the common law tradition inherited from Great Britain, courts had that power. Indeed, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 78 explicitly outlined the concept of judicial review. Whether the power of judicial review can be justifiably constitutional is a question that's been subject to great debate, particularly in recent years. For now, though, let's suffice it to say that in 1803, the Supreme Court claimed this power for itself in Marbury versus Madison, in which the court ruled that a particular provision of an act of Congress was unconstitutional. Bam! Third branch of government, equal to the others. Now, through the process of judicial review, the Supreme Court adapts the Constitution to modern situations. Take electronic technology, for example. It, of course, didn't exist when the Constitution was ratified. Nevertheless, the court has used the Fourth Amendment's guarantees against unreasonable searches and seizures to place limits on the use of wiretapping and other electronic eavesdropping methods. The court has needed to decide whether anti-terrorism laws passed by Congress or state legislatures or measures instituted by the President violate the Fourth Amendment or other constitutional provisions. Additionally, the court has changed its interpretation of the Constitution in accordance with changing values. It ruled in 1896 that separate but equal public facilities for African Americans were constitutional. But by 1950, times had changed. The court reversed that decision. Woodrow Wilson summarized the court's work well when he described it as a constitutional convention in continuous session. Basically, the law is what the Supreme Court says it is at any given time. The Constitution has been changed to interpretation by both Congress and the President. Originally, the President his staff consisted of a personal secretary and very few others. Today, because Congress delegates specific tasks to the President and the Chief Executive assumes political leadership, the Executive Office staff alone has increased to several thousand people. The executive branch provides legislative leadership far beyond the envisionment of the framers. One of the ways in which presidents have expanded their powers is through the use of executive orders. Now, I'll talk about executive orders later in the context of the presidency, later in the semester, but suffice it to say that executive orders have the force of legislation and allow presidents to significantly affect the political landscape. Consider, for example, that affirmative action programs have their origin in executive orders. The idea that the military was desegregated by an executive order of President Truman in 1948. Changes in the ways of doing political business have also altered the Constitution. The Constitution is administered in political parties, yet these informal extra-constitutional organizations make nominations for public office, run campaigns, organize members of Congress, and in fact change the electoral system from time to time. The emergence and evolution of the party system, for example, have changed the way the president is elected. The Constitution calls for the Electoral College to choose the president. But today the people vote for electors who are pledged to the candidate of their party, effectively choosing the president themselves. Perhaps most striking, the Constitution has been adapted from serving up the needs of a small rural republic to providing the framework of government for an industrial giant with vast geographic, natural, and human resources. It's amazing the flexibility that the document has given us. If we were to snap our fingers and make the framers appear today, I believe they would be amazed at its flexibility and how good a job they've done. This is Mr. L, and I'm signing off from our lecture notes on the Constitution. Bring your questions to class, and we'll fit them in around some activities. And as always, be excellent.